Lesson 2.2, Metabolism. How do your cells release energy from food? The goals of this lesson are to introduce students to the major steps in metabolism that result in ATP synthesis, to demonstrate the importance of the mitochondria in ATP synthesis, and to have students analyze and make predictions from scientific data. At the end of this lesson, students should be able to explain why we need to maintain glucose homeostasis and identify the steps of ATP synthesis and describe what they require and produce. We'll achieve these goals through an interrupted case study about a weight loss drug that targets the mitochondria. To prepare for this lesson, you will need to review the key scientific concepts that are presented throughout the lesson. They include metabolism of glucose, including glycolysis, the TCA cycle, and the electron transport chain, understanding of where fatty acids and amino acids fit into the metabolism picture, and mitochondrial structure. You can review the scientific content in the background reading provided for you in the teacher primer, the teacher manual, and the student workbook. The teacher primer provides an in-depth knowledge about the scientific content presented in this lesson. The teacher manual or lesson plan provides a minute-by-minute explanation of the lesson structure, including instructions on how to manage the discussion and the activity. The student workbook provides additional explanations for students. You will need to print one case study worksheet per student. If you will be using the extended review of the mitochondria, you will also need to print out one of these worksheets per student. The key point of the lesson's do now is to engage students by testing their memory of mitochondrial structure. We'll get there by asking students to label the parts of a mitochondria on their worksheet. After giving students time to complete the do now, you will review the answers together and remind students that the function of the inner mitochondrial membrane is so that the proton gradient can be maintained for ATP synthesis. If your students need a more thorough review of the mitochondria, you may want to assign the extended reading and worksheet before moving on to this lesson's activity. The extended review reading and worksheet is available on our website under Lesson 2.2. You can review this concept using the teacher primer and the teacher's manual. The key points of this lesson's activity are: all three types of macronutrients are used for energy, and the mitochondria plays a very large part in producing energy in the form of ATP. We'll get there by having students complete an interrupted case study. Because this is an interrupted case study, you will need to prevent your students from looking ahead because that's where the answers are. Either hand out each page of the case study worksheet one at a time, or tell your students not to turn the page until they are instructed to do so. Students will work alone or in groups to read each part of the case study and answer the corresponding questions before the class reviews the answers together. Caution: you will want to review the readings to make sure that they are at an appropriate level for your students. The interrupted case study is divided into 3 parts. In part 1, students are introduced to the character Dougie and are told that Dougie wants to lose weight. After reading part 1 and answering the questions, the class should review how the mitochondria uses macronutrients to create ATP. In part 2, students are asked to summarize data shown in a bar graph and predict how a weight loss drug alters the proton gradient in the mitochondria. Finally, in part 3, students learn that the weight loss drug uncouples the proton gradient, preventing ATP from being synthesized. You can review all of this information, including answers and explanations, in the teacher's manual. The key points of the lesson's wrap-up are that after being absorbed, macronutrients travel in the blood until they are taken up by the cells that will use them, and the brain and red blood cells can only use glucose for ATP synthesis, while all other cells can use fatty acids or amino acids for ATP. We'll get there by using a model of energy homeostasis. This is the same model of energy homeostasis that students were introduced to in Lesson 2.1. The key point of this lesson's homework is to use the lesson's content to think critically about real-life consequences of energy metabolism. We'll get there by completing a worksheet. Students are asked to answer questions about metabolism and exercise, as well as metabolism and brown fat on their case study worksheet. This is the first lesson where we will ask students to interpret a graph. This is an important skill that students will practice many times throughout the rest of the module. If your students struggle with the graph, it is helpful to first orient them to what the y-axis represents and look at the data one group at a time. Students sometimes struggle with the concept of the proton gradient across the inner mitochondrial membrane. A helpful analogy is that of a dam in the river or reservoir, Like the mitochondrial membrane, the dam prevents the flow of water downhill. When the water is allowed to flow through a channel, the energy release can be captured to provide energy. At the end of this lesson, students should be able to explain why we need to maintain glucose homeostasis and identify the steps of ATP synthesis and describe what they require and produce. In the next two lessons, we are going to learn about the metabolic pathways in more detail. Students should connect that all the end goals of these pathways is to make ATP, and all cells, except red blood cells, which don't have mitochondria, must make most of their ATP via the TCA cycle and the electron transport chain. Don't forget that if you have any questions, concerns, or feedback to let us know. You can contact any of the CTSE team members and we'll be happy to help you.